There we go. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our final season of Bats in Churches Live. And this is also our final event in our final season. So this really is the last hurrah for Bats in Churches Live. I'm Kathy, I'm Communications Officer for Bats in Churches, and I'm joined today by award-winning journalist and author Peter Ross, who we're going to be hearing from. Before I properly introduce Peter, just a little bit about our project. Bats in Churches is a 5-year project. It's a partnership between Bat Conservation Trust, Natural England, Historic England, Churches Conservation Trust, and the Church of England, and we're funded by the Natural Lottery Heritage Fund. Over the last 5 years, we've worked with more than 100 ancient churches, helping church communities find ways to live harmoniously with their resident bats. We've also run the National Bats in Churches survey, bit of a mouthful, which has attempted to discover for the first time how many of our ancient churches are home to bat species, and we'll be releasing the full results of that later on in the year. So without any further ado, I'm really excited to introduce you to today's special guest. We are joined today by Peter Ross, who is an award-winning journalist and author. Peter is a 9 times winner of the Scottish Press Awards. He's an Orwell Fellow, and the reason we're hearing from him today is he's the author of 4 books, the most recent of which is entitled Steeple Chasing, Around Britain by Church. Steeple Chasing was released earlier this month. I assume everybody's had a copy and read it, but if you haven't, I do encourage you to do so. It's an absolutely fantastic read. Peter's last book, A Tomb with a View, was named Non-Fiction Book of the Year at Scotland's National Book Awards. And it was also Radio 4 Book of the Year. And I can imagine, having read it, that Steeple Chasing is going to have an equally prestigious resume. So, Peter, welcome to Bats in Churches, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much, Kathy. I appreciate you having me on. And hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today.
Okay, so we're going to have a little bit of a talk about Steeple Chasing. Whilst Peter and I are talking, if anybody has any questions for Peter, please do put them in the chat, and I'm sure he'd be happy to answer them.
Sure.
If anything comes to mind as we go along, just pop it in the chat and we'll be able to answer them. But we'll start off with some questions from me. So Peter, your most recent 2 books, A Tomb with a View and Steeple Chasing, both refer to churches and churchyards. So what draws you to these special places?
I think it's a number of things. First of all, it's their beauty, the aesthetics. I find old graveyards and cemeteries very stimulating places visually, first of all. I've always thought that, especially when they're a bit run down, I've always thought that like an angel with a broken wing and ivy growing up over the front of her dress was more beautiful than a pristine angel. And I'm also very attracted, likewise, to churches, the way just the magnificence of the buildings very often, whether they're large or small. I think churches are probably most often in people's lives the first building of any real significance or character that they encounter. Whether they go inside them or not, it doesn't matter. There's probably a church at the end of their street or a couple of streets away, and it's the biggest building that they encounter at the earliest moment in their lives. So I think they have an impact on almost all of us, and certainly on me when I was a child. So it's the aesthetics, first of all. The appearance of the churches and also the kind of the sort of art and architectural treasures that they very often contain. But also I'm very attracted to both graveyards and churches for the stories that they tell of individual lives and our collective history. I always think of a graveyard as being like a library in which each stone is an individual book with a story to tell about that person or that family. I think a church is more like an ancient manuscript with a lot of pages rubbed out and overwritten and interesting doodles and illustrations and so on that tells us a story about the place and the people, and sometimes our kind of local and also national history. So there's the beauty, there's the storytelling, but also I think in some ways maybe the thing that is something I feel very strongly, but it's very hard to define and sort of articulate, is the sense of a world beyond this world that is communicated by both these places, graveyards and churches. a sense of the continuing presence of past lives, I think, is something that I feel very strongly. I don't think that's necessarily an exclusively Christian idea. It's just something that I think we can often feel when we're in these places, and I certainly feel it. So it's a mixture of those three things. I think the beauty, the stories, and that almost numinous sense that emanates from both of them.
Brilliant. Thanks, Peter. That's lovely imagery when you were talking about sort of broken angels with ivy climbing over them. Sort of takes me back to when I was young. The village church, as you say, it was a big building in our village, and we had a footpath through it. And I used to love reading the gravestones and kind of witnessing year upon year their deterioration as well, and seeing how they changed. And you kind of really brought that alive for me when you were speaking there. So you've probably already kind of half answered this, but what specifically inspired you to write Steeple Chasing, which is a tour of Britain by church?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things really. One very specifically came out of the writing of my previous book, A Tomb with a View. When I was working on that book, I was down in King's Lynn doing an interview with Dr. Julian Litton, who's a sort of national and international expert on funeral customs. And a friend of mine contacted me saying, "Oh, if you're in King's Lynn, you should take yourself off into the countryside just a few miles to the little village of Stobardolph, and there's something there that you won't want to miss." And this turned out to be the Holy Trinity Church in Stobardolph, which is a tiny little village in the countryside, just south of King's Lynn. And in there, there is a side chapel, and in at one end of the side chapel, there's a cabinet of dark wood with the door closed, always closed, but never locked. And if you open up the door of the cabinet, you're confronted with the wax effigy of a woman called Sarah Hare, who was a member of the local gentry who died in the 18th century. And that chapel is full of tombs of her ancestors and relations, and they're all kind of marble and quite grand. But her idea, and she had this set out in her will, was that she wanted to be remembered and her likeness made in wax. And so, fair enough, there was a bit of a trend for that at the time amongst members of proper high society, particularly the royals. And dukes and duchesses. You know, there's a few of these wax effigies that can be seen in the Queen's Diamond Jubilee galleries in Westminster Abbey. But this is the only one that I know outside of there in Britain. And it's quite different from those. It's very unsettling. I assume it's a perfect likeness. It was made, I think, probably either from a life mask or a death mask. And it's not in any way a kind of flattering portrait. She has she's wearing like a crimson hooded cloak, and she's seen better days in terms of the way that time has treated her. You know, her skin's a bit dirty and mottled, and she's a little bit nibbled by mice, and so and it's just got this incredibly eerie fairy tale quality. And I think there's nothing in the church to tell you that it's there. So I think that if you were to go into that church and just open that cabinet without any kind of forewarning at all, you might well fall down dead on the spot from sheer shock at the sight of this. She's I think buried beneath the church, just at the foot of the effigy. So I encountered the effigy of Sarah Hare, and I thought, that is incredible. I really must write about this. But something made me decide not to put it into A Tomb with a View, just to kind of squirrel it away and hold on to it. And it was really from there that the idea of doing a book about churches grew, because I just thought there must be, this is one of the things about churches, that they contain wonders, and not always positive wonders, but sometimes things that can unsettle us, or that we might find eerie or frightening or disturbing in some way. And I thought, I'll maybe try and write about things like that, or the wonders that churches contain around the country. So there was that specific thing, but there was also a kind of feeling that I wanted a project that would offer me some sense of consolation. I began to work on this in May 2020, planning it in May 2020. So really in the sort of darkest hours of the earliest days of the pandemic. And in addition to that, there was obviously a great deal of a political disenchantment around that time, a feeling of a lot of kind of hatred and negativity and lies in the air, and a sort of wider sense of, or more widespread sense of anxiety and despair around the climate emergency, I think, which is at the root of a lot of the way we feel about things. So I was looking for something that would offer some escape from that, but also a sense of solace. And so I set out really to find that within old churches, within ancient churches. That was the idea. So it was a specific thing, but also a way of trying to find something to essentially make myself feel better and to hopefully offer other people the same kind of solace when they read it.
You touch on so you touch on that in the first chapter of the book, where you write, and I
Yeah.
think you write this beautifully. You write, "I'd grown tired of the present with its anger and fear and lies. I was losing faith in the future. I wanted to delve into our deep past, to be buttressed and braced by history. A close examination of churches and the customs associated with them offered, it seemed, a chance to reconnect with who we were, rediscover who we are, and reconsider who we might yet be. The world, I thought, would look better through stained glass eyes." So you've talked a bit about this kind of feeling of disenchantment and the context in which you started writing Steeple Chasing. So could you tell us that during the process of researching and writing the book, did it change that feeling of disenchantment? Did it kind of give you more of a hope for the future?
Well, I mean, I can't say that I finished the book feeling like a sunny optimist. I think it's possibly just not really maybe in my nature to feel that. But I think that it's certainly true to say that the sort of narrative of the book moves from darkness to light, literally and metaphorically. It begins in midwinter 2020. That's where the story begins, and at Pluscarden Abbey in Elgin, sort of north of Aberdeen, and it ends at midsummer 2022 on Holy Island, watching the rising sun. So it doesn't sort of end, or I didn't sort of come away with a feeling that everything was going to be all right forever, but I did feel certainly what the book did was it led me into encounters with people at their best, really, and people past and present at their best. I think churches are in some ways the expressions in stone and wood and glass of the best of us, in that we've created these buildings for a particular purpose, the worship of God, the expression of that belief, and as a result of the strength of that belief, we've made them often very beautiful. So we've expressed the best of our kind of intellect and the best of our creativity and what we can do with our minds and our hands in the creation of these places, so that when we go into them now, we sort of get a sense of the skills of people in the past being put to this positive purpose. But not only that, because the churches now are are these kind of old, sometimes quite frail buildings that are being cared for by people who may not even be believers themselves. So you have people that go in there who are believers, perhaps of the church warden, and they're responsible for opening the church and closing it and all the other things that church wardens do. But perhaps they are the local person in the village who volunteers to clean in the church, or they might be the person who volunteers to ring the bells, not because they necessarily have a Christian faith, but because they understand the local church to be an expression of community and continuity over a very long time, and they see it as important for that reason, and they don't want it to shut down or be pulled down on their watch. So it's still the expression of the best of us, I think, in that we're often trying to help our local communities and our neighbours and friends through often almost always voluntary action. So I felt cheered by those encounters. Really, I felt like I was seeing the best of people centuries before and also now, really. So that was kind of where the sense of solace came from. It wasn't necessarily that I went on a pilgrimage looking for um, consolation in the idea of a better world to come. I don't feel that we necessarily need to wait for that. I can see it now in the actions of people past and present.
Lovely. We're going to sort of stay, I think, with a similar theme. Here at
Mhm.
Baptist churches, we've worked with over 100 ancient churches around England, and you can hear we call them ancient churches or
Mhm.
historic. I think history is a word that seems really strongly associated with the past. So I'm quite interested to find out, kind of from writing Steeple Chasing, what place do churches have in the present, and what place can or should they hold in the future?
Okay. Well, let me just begin answering that question by quoting from someone that I've quoted within the book, actually, if that's okay. Rachel Morley, who's the director of Friends and Friendless Churches. I interviewed her in Wales as part of the book, and she spoke to me about the 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 sort of wider importance of the buildings, if you like, rather than necessarily the utilitarian purpose, which I will get to. But in terms of the wider purpose of the buildings, Rachel said to me, "These buildings transcend time. They are the spiritual investment and the artistic legacy of generations, and a community's greatest expression of itself over centuries. There's a concentration of shared human experience within their walls, which means that churches like this are a monument to the lives of thousands of ordinary people who have been completely forgotten about. This is their gift to the future." I think that's really powerful, and we need to protect it. And I think that's absolutely true. I do feel that when you go into an old church in particular, you can smell the dust and the damp, but the thing that you feel, especially when you go in alone, is the centuries of emotions that people have brought to the place. So they've gone there with feelings of love, for perhaps on the occasion of their marriages, or love for God. They've gone there at times of great sorrow in their lives, great despair, but they've gone there perhaps with a feeling of hope or faith. And I think that the effectively what's happened is that somehow all of that has got into the stones. The stones have almost acted as receivers for those centuries of emotions. So what you feel, what I feel, and I think other people feel this when you go into an old church, is that accumulated ache of centuries of human experience. So I think they're important from that point of view, because they put us in touch with ourselves, and the people that we were and the people that we still are. But also they have this other kind of utilitarian purpose, don't they? So churches are still used for, apart from the fact that they're used for worship, they're used for lots of kind of practical purposes. I mean, in the book, I spend a bit of time at the Church of St. Martin in the Fields, in London, which is the church just overlooking Trafalgar Square. It's got a long history of helping people that are homeless, and that continues now with people that have come to London from overseas, as often as refugees, migrants of various kinds, and don't have recourse to any kind of public funds, and aren't allowed to find work either. So they don't have anything; they're destitute. And St. Martin in the Fields is engaged in giving them hot meals and providing them with clothes and showers and so on. And there's stuff like that, of course, that churches are doing the length and breadth of the country. So there's a really important, utilitarian purpose that they have, at the same time as this sort of, this sort of more, this harder to define sort of spiritual quality that I think they have.
Thanks, Peter. I really love how you phrased that. I'm not going to remember your exact phrasing about the kind of cumulative ache of human emotion absorbed
Yeah,
by churches. And we ran a Bats in Churches live event last year looking at the wider issue of bats in sacred spaces around the world. And one of the questions that I was left with after that was, can bats and other residents of churches, non-human residents of churches, is that atmosphere and that kind of feeling of sacred places something that they're drawn to, or something that makes a church an ideal habitat for them? And it's not a question we can answer, because we can't ask bats how they feel about the sort of solemnity of churches, but it was something that stuck with me. But we are going to talk about bats now, because you visited our project church of St Margaret's in Saxlingham for Steeple Chasing, and
yeah,
you wrote a fantastic chapter to your experience with the bats. So I sort of, I was going to ask you what you learned about the bats during your time, and your sense of the relationship between bats and churches and the church communities. And I think, the chapter itself really expresses that well. So I think you're going to
yeah.
read to us now, which will be lovely.
Yes, yes. If that's okay with everyone, I thought it would probably be best to try and answer this by trying to just read a little bit from this chapter. I'm going to read maybe it's actually the shortest chapter in the book, but I kind of had an idea that I wanted it to sort of flit through the book in a kind of small way. There's a chapter on cats as well, which is a little bit larger, but yeah, this is the chapter about bats. I'm going to read maybe about a third of this chapter. It'll take me about 10 minutes to do that, and I'm going to leave out some of the stuff that kind of explains how incredible bats are, because I assume there's probably a lot of knowledge of that on this call. So there won't be much from me about echolocation here, but there's stuff about that in the book for lay people who maybe aren't so up on bats. Anyway, this chapter is called Bats. What is it like to be a bat? So asked the philosopher Thomas Nagel in 1974 in an essay of that title. It's a good question, difficult to answer. The way those mammals experience and perceive their environment is so different from human consciousness that we cannot easily extrapolate from our own perception of, say, an old dark church and think our way into the mind of a bat flying through the nave at midnight. Even without the benefit of a philosophical reflection, Nagel wrote, anyone who has spent some time in an enclosed space with an excited bat knows what it is to encounter a fundamentally alien form of life. I thought of this one sultry evening in July when I joined the ecologist Philip Parker and his team for a bat survey at the Church of St Margaret, Saxlingham, a few miles inland from Norfolk's northern coast. It was getting on for sundown and they were setting up for the night. 4 women and Phil and all their kit, lights, cameras, bat detectors, camping chairs, bug spray, flasks of tea. The hiss of running water that I took for an unseen river turned out to be a fountain in the garden of the Elizabethan manor house next door. St Margaret's is a square-towered 15th century construction, much remodelled by the Victorians. Above the door, carved into stone, are the words, "Let everything that hath breath praise the Lord." A good motto for a church full of bats. Yes, said Kate, one of the surveyors, they are part of the church, part of the congregation. Not everyone feels that way. The romantic idea of bats in churches is often contradicted by the unromantic reality. Bat poo on the Bible and in the vicar's hair. Bat pee on the keys of the organ and in the communion wine. Dead bats on pews and in loos. Live bats flying out of the manger during the nativity play. These are the horrors you hear. A heavy bat presence smells a bit like a seabird colony, but not as strong. Bad enough, though, to put couples off getting married in an affected church, with the resultant loss of income. Churches have even had to close because elderly parishioners can't keep on top of the cleaning. The droppings, though unsightly, can be swept up, but urine is the real problem. It eats into the fabric of the building, sparing nothing, not even rare and valuable brass. Many a Crusader knight has been burned and scarred by the pee of an infidel bat. If you wanted to design the perfect bat roost, you would probably end up with an English medieval church. Rose Riddell, an engagement officer with the Bats and Churches project, had explained before my visit. Most churches are built with the altar in the east, meaning that they have a long south side, the roof of which catches the sun and is nice and warm in summer for maternity roosts. Churchyards are rich in insect life, an easy food source without flying far. The walls of old churches, especially those as in Norfolk, built from uneven pieces of flint mortared together, often develop small holes where stones fall out, allowing entry and exit. In winter, when bats need stable cold and humidity to maintain a torpor state similar to hibernation, they will doze away the bleakest months in the church's tower or crypt. The only part of a church that bats don't usually much like, contrary to the popular saying, is the belfry. Far too windy and noisy. Bats and bells don't mix. Inside St. Margaret's, sitting on a pew near the door, Phil Parker had almost finished setting up his monitors. He's in his 50s and a great man for bats. How do you feel about them? I asked him. What? He laughed. Apart from love them. Vespertine shadows obscured the chancel. We would soon be able to see the bats leaving their roost, made visible on screen by infrared and thermal imaging cameras. Phil spends his summers engaged in this work. From mid-May to September, he is out 5 or 6 times a week. The idea is not just to count the bats, but to identify where they exit a church and where, a few hours later, they come back in. This means being there at dusk and still there at dawn. It's a job of gloamings and cockcrows. I sleep better in a church than I do at home, Phil said. Except that is here at Saxlingham, the only church in which he will not spend the night. It's quite small, with lots of bats and nowhere to get under cover. His camp bed would end up soaked. So he dozes in his car and considers it worth the discomfort. If you're an ecologist and you see it as a job, then you're not a proper ecologist, he said. It's a vocation. It's not about money. It's about interest and love for the things you're trying to protect. Having experienced a significant decline in numbers dating back at least the start of the 20th century, bats have been protected by law since 1981. It is a criminal offence to kill or injure them and to damage, disturb, or obstruct a roost. This means that churches have to live with their bats. Indeed, the whole point of the Bats and Churches project is not to exclude the animals, but to manage the way they use the building in a way that is compatible with how people want to use it. A few congregations have gone beyond mere toleration and have found ways to rebalance and even monetize the relationship, selling bat merchandise, for example, or running bat walks. Others rather like the idea of providing a home for bats, to the point that they are competitive about numbers. St Mary's in Gaytonthorpe has the second largest known bat roost in a Norfolk church, around 550 pipistrelles, and one of the committee members has her eye on the number 1 spot. Bats do not always find safety in a church. Most of the worst cruelties are many years in the past, thankfully, but the animals do, at times, suffer for trying to share space with humans. Recently, said Phil, we had a report of someone who had picked up a baby bat from a pew and went outside and stamped on him. We got the police involved because that's just abhorrent, isn't it? We know in the past that roosts have been gassed. One church used to have what they called bat whacking night, catching them as they were coming in and killing them. Another church we worked on, plastic and carpets had been nailed over the door to stop the bats coming in. We found churches with spotlights shining up at the roost. We frequently come across people using powerful ultrasonic devices to try and deter bats. Other places have put stuffed owls in the church. Another got someone with a motorbike to run up and down the nave to try and kill them with carbon monoxide. Two churches, they use cyanide. In St. Margaret's, the bats roost in the chancel above the altar. They usually come in through the north transept in a tiny gap at the top of the wall. We switched on our head torches, and Phil led the way through the church. A copy of the Daily Telegraph had been laid upon a brass memorial set into the floor, protecting it from urine. I had no such defence. I could feel, but not see, a spritz against my anorak. There you go, said Phil. You've been christened. He showed me what he was doing to mitigate the bat issue. The idea is to contain them in the north transept by putting in a false ceiling and creating a void in which they can roost. There is justice in this surrender of a little territory. It is, after all, as a consequence of human behaviour that bats are increasingly coming into churches. The clearing of dead trees and the conversion of agricultural buildings, such as barns and tumble-down cottages, into holiday accommodation forces them to seek shelter elsewhere. The bats are, in a sense, refugees fleeing urban encroachment and agricultural intensification. To allow them sanctuary seems the least we can do. This is not to minimize the problems their presence creates, but perhaps there is an opportunity. One could argue that churches with bat populations ought to qualify for public funding, similar to that offered to farmers who promote wildlife diversity and restore natural habitats. A roost for the bats, a boost for the churches, winners all round. I went outside to see how the survey was coming along. To supplement the special cameras, lamps had been directed to the side of one of the known exits so that surveyors could count the bats that flew out. Red filters were used so as not to disturb the bats with white light and deter them from emerging. This practical measure had an atmospheric effect. The church appeared lit for a vampire movie. The walls were bloody, the churchyard too. I sat against the gravestone to enjoy the show. There it goes, said Kate, over the top of your head. Did you see? I did, sort of, though it was more as if I sensed it. A small, dark shape, very fast, a couple of feet above me, a tatter of shadow tossed by the wind. Kate's bat detector was picking up its echolocation. The sound is commonly likened to the crackle of burning stubble, she explained, but it seemed to me more like dice rattling in a cup. Can you see it circling around? She asked. What a fascinating creature. It feels good to do this work. Progressive. It makes me feel like I'm protecting the church and the bats. And I'll just leave it there, but the chapter does go on from there.
And it's a very good chapter. So as ever, highly recommend. Thank you, Peter. It's really great to hear firsthand your experiences of St. Margaret's in Saxlingham, which is one of our project churches here at Bats in Churches.
Yeah.
In fact, a lot of the book is in Norfolk and in the east of England. And actually quite a lot of our project churches are in Norfolk. We've got quite a big distribution of churches in Norfolk, and we're not 100% sure if that's reflective of bats in East Anglia suffering more from habitat loss, or if perhaps those churches, dioceses were more engaged with the project. But you spent a fair bit of time in Norfolk in the east of England as well. Was there anything about that area that felt special in terms of its churches, or different? You've mentioned the kind of building materials they used. Was there any sort of feel?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there is quite a lot about Norfolk in the book. I mean, to some extent, the areas that I covered within the book were defined a little by where I could get to. Um, I had to change my plans many times because I was writing this during the pandemic, and at certain points, travel restrictions were pretty tight, and it was difficult to go to places and meet with people, and lots of events that I intended to go to got cancelled. So there was a lot of kind of rejigging of things. And but having said that, it isn't just an accident that there's so much of Norfolk in there. I do find myself quite fascinated by that part of England. It's not a part of England that I knew particularly well beforehand. I think other than King's Lynn, I'm not sure that I'd really been before. But there's something about the way it looks that I find incredibly exciting. And when I was there, the few days that I was there, it was during a heat wave. It was the first time that the Met Office had put out a red heat warning, and as I was kind of driving around from church to church across that landscape, that flat landscape, you could see across these kind of fields of green corn and whatever other crops are kind of being grown down there. You could see the sort of steeples poking up from out of the land, and there was also, because of the heat, there was the sort of shimmer on top of the road surface, and there was sort of poppies blazing at the sides of the road. So the whole thing felt very kind of heightened and hallucinatory. And then, of course, I was encountering Sarah Hare and things like that. So the whole thing did feel like quite a trip, really, in more ways than one, going to Norfolk. And yeah, I mean the round towers of the churches around there, and yeah, just a very beautiful part of England, and one that I'd like to sort of return to. Really, it wasn't so much just the architecture of the churches; it was something about the whole feeling of the place. I remember when I did that visit to St Margaret's Saxlingham. Obviously, I was awake for most of the night. I think I had like an hour or 2 hours in the car at the same time as Phil slept, and then we're up again to watch the bats coming in the morning. And then after that, I drove back to where I was staying, which was I think was in Kings Lynn. So I was like the only car on the road at, um, 4 in the morning or something like that, 5 in the morning, just driving across that landscape as the sun was coming up. And I remember seeing like muntjac kind of leaping through the fields, and it was just an extraordinary thing. Just felt like a very different landscape from the one I'm used to in Scotland, and one that I found really exciting.
That's some amazing imagery again. That must have been quite a sort of a very surreal and magical experience, driving back from a bat survey in a Norfolk church at 5 in the morning.
Yeah.
It's kind of it feels sort of quintessentially English countryside as well, to me.
Yeah.
And I kind of could see that imagery that you were painting of the steeples, and I'm quite familiar with Norfolk from cycling. So like for us cyclists, it's great because it's flat, but then you've got the
Yeah.
headwinds. You can't have everything. Okay, we are actually motoring through here, and we've still got a fair bit to cover. So we're gonna move on and talk about the people. So, steeple chasing is
Yeah.
about churches, and it's also about people. And people and their stories and their experience seem to have been really integral to your experience of churches. And I love this quote at the end of the book where you write, "Those people I had encountered on my journey seemed to me strong-hearted, not saints or martyrs, ordinary men and women with a tremendous capacity for endurance and love." And I'm curious to sort of know what you think. What is it about being part of a church community that inspires these qualities in people? And how do you think church communities differ from other forms of communities and institutions?
Yeah, I mean, it's not so much. I'm not doing any. I'm not really intending any sort of special pleading for Christianity there at all. As I was saying earlier, it's more that I think that these buildings, which are the kind of focus within a community, they have been for centuries, and they continue in a way to be the focus because they're still buildings that are used for various purposes, and people, even if they aren't believers, they often, very often, recognize the importance of them and want to kind of keep them going. That's really what I'm getting at, is the feeling that it's kind of love that people have for their own place and for their own history and for their neighbors and their families and their kin, both blood and not. So it isn't really so much that they're a faith community. It's more that these buildings often they contain so much of our histories, sort of national and personal. I think that's what I'm getting at there. Really, it's the fact that people recognize the value of that and try to keep it going. And obviously, this was again the pandemic was the kind of the sort of emotional climate in which this book was written, and that was a time when I think we saw a lot of the time we saw people at their best in terms of voluntary activity and looking out for neighbours and things. I think we see that on a sort of smaller scale around church communities, but again, it's not really a Christian thing. You know, I think that this. I'm not saying that these places are important because they're the house of God. I'm saying they're important because for centuries people have believed them to be the house of God, and that's why they've made them beautiful. And that's why they've continued to. That's why they kind of continue to look after them, because they recognise that sort of sense of continuity. I think if you go into an old church, you often see a board on the wall that lists the sort of priests going back through the centuries, and you can see that these places have been used at times of sickness and strife, like we had, like our own. You know, they've been used during plagues and wars, which are familiar to us as well. So it's that sense of a connection to the people of the past, but also an admiration of their resilience and a feeling I have of like an arm around the shoulder when you go into these places, that somebody's been through it all before, maybe everything's going to be okay. Wider than that, though, as a writer, it's really important to me to have lots of interviews in my stories and in my books. I think I want my work to be full of other voices, full of other lives, not just my own, so that it feels kind of, when people read the book, so they feel sort of open and generous and democratic, and they feel like a conversation on the page. That's really important to me, to have that in there, which is why I do interview so many people. I mean, you can't really tell just now when it's just me talking, but the book's absolutely full of encounters with people, not just the people of the past that I write about, but living people, right, talking to me about what the various churches that I go to have come to mean to them, and yeah, not just as places of worship, but as just as important sites. Yeah.
Brilliant. Yeah, I mean the people in the book, it's fantastically evident when you read the book, the amount of people you've met, the stories they've told you. It's it's very much the stories of people and their churches. But not just people, because you and the people you speak to seem to have a real connection with animals in churches. There's the chapter on the church cat, there's the chapter on the bats, there's the dogs at Glastonbury. So, as a kind of animals and heritage project ourselves, really interested to get your take on this connection between animals and churches. What does this bring, and how do animals fit into churches and church communities?
Yeah, well, like you say, there was the chapter on bats, which I read a little bit from. There's also a chapter on cats, which you mentioned. I'm interested in the relationship between cats and churches. I mean, generally speaking, it's quite difficult, isn't it, to know whether animals can make any distinction between whether these buildings feel different to animals than other buildings might do, whether a church feels different somehow to a bat than an old barn does. It's impossible to know that, isn't it? One would suspect not, but who knows? I mean, there's a fascinating article in The Guardian today about the way animals think and about animal consciousness and how it's much more sophisticated than we once thought. But I do write a bit about cats in churches, because there's a long history of cats in churches, just as there is bats in churches. There will have been bats in churches for as long as there have been churches, and likewise cats, because they'll have been brought into churches for very practical reasons to kind of keep down the mice. But there is something about having a cat in a church that is terribly, it's sort of at once comical and quite moving, I think. That cats in churches are very popular online. You see a lot of stuff on social media about churches with their resident cats. I wrote in particular about Dorkins Magnificat, who was the cat that came to live a few years ago at Southwark Cathedral in London. Dorkins was a stray cat that turned up at the door one day and was brought inside by a verger, and came to live within Southwark Cathedral until quite close to the end of her life. And the people that knew Dorkins, I was lucky enough to meet Dorkins towards the end of her life myself, but the people that knew her well did seem to have a sense that she had some kind of idea of it as a sacred place or as a special place in some way, and that she saw herself as having some kind of role in the life of the church. She kind of understood that the way that people seemed quite drawn to the church to meet the cat. It was a way of kind of getting people to visit a church that might otherwise not be comfortable going into a church. They would go in to see the cat, so the cat was kind of gateway drug for the church. But it wasn't not in a kind of manipulative, exploitative sense. There was an idea that the cat did, as I say, have some kind of awareness of the importance of the space. And then Dorkins was caught up in the London Bridge terror attacks. She was outside when that happened, and seems to have been quite traumatized by the sort of the flashing lights and the sirens and the screams and so on. So once she went back into Southwark Cathedral after that night, she actually never went outside again. She wasn't willing to venture back outside the doors of the cathedral until she was taken out and taken home taken to the home of one of the vergers who particularly looked after her and who decided to look after her in her retirement. Rather than having her euthanized, he decided to sort of care for her towards the end of her days. It wasn't safe for her in the church any longer. It was too big a space and her eyesight was going. So she was prone to having falls and things. So she needed to be looked after in a much smaller space. So that's how she came to live with one of the vergers. She lived there till the end of her life. And then they had a memorial service for her in Southwark Cathedral, which was in some ways quite controversial because it was at the time when numbers at human funerals were restricted because of coronavirus rules. So there was some criticism of the cathedral for having such a thing, although they too had they had the same kind of number restrictions and spacing. But they also put that service online, and many people who watched it online in a live stream found it to be tremendously moving. And the air it's maybe difficult for people to remember, but the air at that time felt absolutely kind of swollen with grief. And certainly for some people that watched that service, there was some kind of sense of release within it, some kind of sense of purging. People needed some way to let go of their emotions that had been sort of tightly held for some time. So I mean that's a kind of long-winded way of answering your question, I guess, by telling you that story about Dorkins. But I do think there is something about these little animals within these little short-lived animals within these great ancient spaces that I find terribly moving. It's that sort of like contrast or juxtaposition between their transience and the sort of eternity that's symbolized by the buildings. But I think it's not just comical. It's not a comical juxtaposition. I think there is something quite graceful about these animals, a sort of freedom from human sinfulness or something like that. Yeah, I guess you could go down that route if you wanted to. And I think, yes, as I say in the book, a bat in the church is no small thing, and likewise a cat.
Absolutely. I love that story about Dawkins. And actually, when I was reading it in Steeple Chasing, it brought to mind a memory of books I used to read as a child about a church cat, and it's one of those things. I was quite young, and I can remember the cover, but I can't quite remember the details of it, or kind of
Mm.
wrote it or whatever. But I remember it being quite an important thing for me, and I loved the imagery in the book, as you say, of the animals within these huge historic buildings. So that really sort of brought up a connection to childhood for me as well, which I wondered if might be something around the animals in churches thing as well. It kind of connects us to perhaps the childhood part of us who loved to think of animals populating human spaces in an equal capacity.
Yeah,
I
and
love,
we see,
I
of
love
course, we see animals, of course, don't we, within the churches themselves, within the fabric of the churches themselves, carved onto bench ends, or in stained glass windows. I think there's a few stained glass windows that have got bats in them. Certainly, cats appear in stained glass, birds of all kinds. So it's not unfamiliar territory that we should have animals in churches, I think.
there used to be a
And of
hashtag
course, the
on
donkey.
Twitter as well, called Animals in Churches. I think it was a Wednesday afternoon when people would post pictures of things like you say, bats in stained glass and animals in carvings and stuff. And there's like a whole momentum behind animals in
Yeah.
churches, which is really nice, I think.
Hmm. Absolutely. And they've got a new cat, and they've got a new cat in Southwark Cathedral now called Hodge, which is much more person friendly. So Dorkins never really liked to be stroked or anything, but if people go to Southwark Cathedral now, they're much more likely to see Hodge, and he might even tolerate your a bit of stroking. Who knows?
I'm glad they got a new cat. I did wonder about that. I like what you're saying about the cat being kind of the gateway drug for people, because one thing that we've really found within the project, and you reference it in your chapter about bats, is that church communities that can embrace coexisting with their bats do find they can attract an audience that might not necessarily be engaged with the core message of the church. They might not be engaged in Christianity, but they're engaged with wildlife. They want to come and help out with the bat surveys. They want to come and count the species in the churchyard, get involved with things like Churches Count on Nature. And churches are, and communities are, I think, finding that this is a way to reach an audience, a kind of a younger audience, a more engaged audience than perhaps you have previously. So yeah, they really do serve they can even, as you say, be monetized. They really serve a purpose. um
Yeah.
I'm conscious of time, Peter, because I feel like we could go on for quite some time here. It's just so fascinating speaking with you.
Mm.
But one thing I did want to pick up on kind of before we close, and once again, I issue an invitation. If anybody has questions for Peter, do pop them in the chat and we'll try and get to them. But I think the last thing I wanted to pick up with you is a real thread that's run through the book and through the way you've talked today, which was the pandemic. Um,
Mm.
and kind of the impact that had, the impact it had on you, the impact it had on the churches. And I guess I had in mind, like, what do you think the book would have been like pre-pandemic,
Mm.
or almost like 5 years post-pandemic? But then, of course, it wouldn't be Steeple Chasing. It would be a different book set in a different time. But if you could just kind of expand on how the
Sure.
pandemic
Sure.
really
Sure.
fundamentally shaped the
I
book.
mean, I
Great.
mean, so as I say, I began to sort of plan the book in May of 2020. So at that point, we it wasn't very clear how long the pandemic was going to last. If people can remember that, there was a lot of kind of talk about being over by Christmas, and there wasn't a vaccine at that point either. So it wasn't clear how it was going to be over by Christmas and so on. So there was a lot of uncertainty around how to approach this in the book, really, and whether we could just avoid it altogether, or just wait a little bit, and then just start working on the book after that. So it definitely wasn't my intention to write a book that had anything about the pandemic in it. That was never the intention. But as we kind of went along, it became clear to me that it wouldn't be possible to avoid it at all. And partly that's just because it was just ubiquitous. It permeated everyone's consciousness. It made me think about, if you read a book now that was written between 1939 and 1945, you would expect it to have at least some shadow of the war in it, whether explicit or not. And this, although they're not, clearly the two things aren't the same, there are some similarities, I think, between a world war and what we've been through, and that it was a kind of global event. Everyone was affected by it. It was in all our minds all the time, and it affected, it killed a lot of people, and it affected day-to-day life. So and also it did other things, like it really um affected our sense of time, I think, and also our memory. So it was all kind of stuff that I found very interesting. I wanted to write about, and absolutely felt that I absolutely had to write about. Really, I couldn't avoid it. It was the emotional context of the book, inevitably. There was just no way of getting around it. But I didn't want it to be all about the pandemic. It's not all about the pandemic. That stuff appears more at the start, and it sort of tails away as the book goes on. As I say, it has this movement from darkness to light as we kind of emerge from the sort of toughest restrictions into being able to move around and meet people again and so on. But yeah, I felt it really had to be addressed. And then when I went to the book opens at Plascarden Abbey, in near Elgin in Murrayshire, where I spent a few days among the monks, the Benedictine monks of Plascarden. And just by coincidence, on my first day there, just around the time they were celebrating Mass, the first person in the world, Margaret Keenan in Coventry, a woman in her 90s, was given the Pfizer vaccine. And so I felt there was something about that happening at exactly the same time as I was there, sort of in the midst of this ancient rite, that was serendipitous. And I felt it meant that this is right. You should be doing this. This is the right way to approach it. You know, whether people will feel that when they read it or not, I don't know. I do want to stress that the book isn't full of that, you know, so people shouldn't be put off by that. But I felt it would have been disingenuous, and it would have been essentially impossible to write about the things of this book, which are life and death and how we live, and how we think about the people we've lost, and how we are resilient in the face of difficulties, and about darkness and light. It would have been impossible to get into that territory without referencing what we were at that present moment going through. So yeah, that's why it's in the book.
Yeah. And I think also there's something kind of about the value, the things we lost during the pandemic, especially during the lockdowns, were our sense of community, our physical gathering places, everything that essentially a church represents, a physical gathering place for the community, and you know, and for the celebration and expression of emotions around human rites of passage, you know, from birth to death and everything in between. And yeah, it feels like it's fitting. But I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Thank you everyone for coming along. I don't know about you, but I could quite happily spend another hour on and much more besides chatting with Peter about Steeple Chasing. It's a fantastic book, and you know, thank you for coming along and telling us more about it, and spending this hour with us at Bats and Churches. We really appreciate it. We'll encourage absolutely everybody, if, as I say, if you haven't already, do go and buy Steeple Chasing. And thank you very much, Peter, for joining us today.
Thanks everyone, I appreciate it. Thanks, have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye.
I'm going to stop recording.